Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Many of us here, I'm sure, have seen the evolution of Australian wine because it's happened so quickly in decades rather than centuries or millennia as elsewhere in the world. It's been from, well, not exactly one-dimensional wine, but wine largely straightforward expression of fruit and sunshine and alcohol, rather than nuanced place wines of like the wines of today. So we're very privileged to welcome Mac Forbes, who's one of the leading players in the new subtleties of his country's wine, especially in his home Yarra Valley. He was born there, though not into a wine growing family. They were only loosely involved with wine. His own first experience of wine working wine, was as a world traveling 18-year-old in Gaillac in southwest France, where he ran out of money and had to look for a job. And from there, he went on to a wine degree, and he's had very varied experience all over the world. But today he's back in the Yarra Valley and doing extraordinary things with wines of terroir. So Mac, please tell us about what James Halliday has described as wines born out of philosophy and place. Over to you.
That lovely introduction, and I should just say there's a degree of apprehension around this technology in the Yarra Valley tonight. So I apologise if there's any delays in the audio or the video. We are in the middle of harvest. I should also probably warn you that if I hear anything go crash and bang, you might hear it, and I might have to slip out. But it is the energy and the thrust of harvest that we love. So thanks for joining this morning, and or whatever time it is that you're watching this. For a long time, I've battled, I guess, with the role that I've played in the industry, and I think coming in from as first generation wine into a region that has got a surprisingly rich history of wine. I probably hadn't fully appreciated the depth of the history here. I think it just highlights what a remarkable industry this is, and I think the deeper I get into this industry and my journey in life, I am forever grateful that I found my way to this point. It's helping me enormously, and I look at a lot of peers my age, and especially some younger, I guess, colleagues, and how wine seems to be a great vehicle to better understand this, being of Euro descent to start with, and I was born here, but what it means to be Australian and how we can better engage our soils. I think the old, a lot of us probably came here via our criminal activities that got us deported here as families, and we have this incredible ability to knock down people who are successful. So we're very reluctant to stand up and be, I guess, too proud. And so I think the mirror effect of wine and the cultural sort of, the people who've helped me from outside of this country have probably been the most profound at times. So all I'm wanting to do this morning is to share some of the journey and give a little bit of an insight to what the industry looks like here today and just how dynamic it is. I think it is obviously an industry of many parts, but there is a sense of growing into our skin a little bit, which probably reflects the broader, I guess, culture and mindset of us as a country in general. So that's the objective. We'll see how we go. While we're opening up the slides, and I've got, I think, about 10 or 15 slides, which I don't normally use slides, but I just thought for context, it's a really lovely way to start. And then we'll get through the slides and get rid of those and just get to talking, I guess. But yeah, as was mentioned earlier, any questions as we go, very happy to answer. But if we want to kick that off, I think just jumping in from I guess, a geography point of view, obviously we're a pretty big country. We have got an incredibly old, we're an incredibly old continent with a lot of soils we're working with today of between 200 and 450 million years old. There's a lot of geography in terms of the continent as it drifted north there was a lot of volcanic activity that gradually led to the Dividing Range, which is a mountain range that runs down the east coast of Australia now, and plays a really significant role in my region, the Yarra Valley, which is about an hour east of Melbourne. So we're in the bottom right-hand corner. We have three major climatic influences coming from different directions. We're considered cool climate. Here we go. Cool climate with moderate rainfall, I guess. So you can see Victoria on the mainland in the bottom southeast corner, and from there we're about an hour east of Melbourne. I think, and I had a bit of a spat with one of the top SOMs in London the other day who was posting about Australian Shiraz, and he gave all the typicity of Australian Shiraz, and I'd probably, you know, nearly 50 years of age and having worked in the industry for a few years, I don't like conflict, but I do feel a sense of responsibility to push back now and represent the country that I stand on a little bit more strongly than I would have, you know, a decade or two ago. So I took issue with him on I think it was on Instagram, and said, look, we don't want these generic tasting notes for Shiraz. The country is thousands of kilometres spread out, and the soils vary so hugely. And I've had the opportunity to work with fruit from all over the country, and to generalise is just way too hard. So it's still this battle that we've got of perception and reality, and I think it's obviously not supported by what we've done so successfully in the past of demystifying wine, putting grape on the front of a label. While it's been great for probably the supermarkets to be able to have these wines that were so accessible, and you could recognise Chardonnay and Shiraz, and it made sense, and it became a lovely language to understand wine. I think we've done ourselves an incredible disservice by removing place from the conversation, and that now becomes, in my opinion, our number one challenge. We can jump to the next slide if that's all right. What I think I put next was just a little snapshot of part of the Yarra Valley, which are some of the vineyards that we work with. And so my background, or maybe let's go back to the Yarra history in terms of wine. From the 1880s until around the 1930s, Cabernet was the mainstay of the wine industry here. And there was quite a bit of Cabernet exported to the UK with great success, apparently. There was a lot of excitement around, apparently, about the potential for this region to offer something that was recognisable, had its own character, yet could sit on an international stage. So there was a strong Swiss influence. There's still a number of Swiss families. And so you can see Gruyere on the map there. There's Yering. There's a few places that definitely tie back to the Swiss roots. And then in around the 1920s, 1930s, as Europe was getting back on their feet after phylloxera, and also a shipping route change, as it turned out, that took our wines via South Africa, which then saw greater deterioration of the wines as they moved up to the UK. The industry, really fell apart and vanished for, a number of decades. And it wasn't until the 1960s that there were a handful of doctors who were running a couple of practices in Lilydale, which you can see on the map there. That was sort of considered out of Melbourne and was the gateway to the Yarra. Well, now it's suburbia all the way from Melbourne to Lilydale. But at the time, there were a lot of areas of farming agricultural land between Lilydale and Melbourne. And so these 5 or 6 GPs who were highly intelligent, surprisingly well-travelled, incredibly competitive, a healthy dose of ego, and they started putting vines in the ground. Now, the farming back then was dry farming. The density of the vines was typically based around the available tractors. But some of those wines from the late 60s through to the early 80s, if you get a chance to drink them today, they are incredibly vivid, pure, vibrant, medium-bodied wines. And so the claret, that we refer to of the Bordeaux blend, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, and some Malbec, they were, quite widely planted as a family. And even to this day, if we have guests coming through and we have a chance to show a bunch of wines that we're making and we finish with one of these old clarets, the body language of the person just changes and it becomes this, it's like we've arrived somewhere. And so in our quest, I guess, to find our identity and who we really are, it's both reassuring and lovely and almost amusing that we've already had such a great expression of the Yarra Valley dating back to the 60s. And I think it was just how we veered off course in between that has been something we've been addressing ever since sort of the late 80s and early 90s, when we were trying to make these blockbuster wines that just didn't suit the region. So we've got a bunch of sub-regions, and the Yarra Valley is incredibly diverse. We've got the dividing range, the mountain range that comes down the east coast, actually finishes in the Yarra Valley. So you can see on the top right-hand corner of the map there, there's quite significant mountain ranges there, still with a huge amount of national forest. We've got multiple soil types, and we can flick through. The next two slides are just two of the obvious soil types. So that's our sedimentary clay rock loam, based around the old Yarra River, which the old Yarra River used to be much larger than it is now. It was, kilometres wide, whereas now you could throw a rock across it at places. But these are two slides that show, or two photos that show some fairly common profiles within the Yarra. There's clay, it's quite leached clay. You've got some sedimentary rock that we can't really see there, but quite shallow topsoil. We can go to the next slide. And this is the red volcanic. And this is on the back of all that volcanic activity that created the dividing range that runs down the east coast of Australia. And these are incredibly old soils. They're not these highly rich, fertile soils that you'd think of in Sicily or places like that. These are moderately low to moderate vigor. When the Greeks and the Italians first came out to Melbourne, they were all drawn to the red soils for obvious reasons. They planted a lot of crops, and they were more vigorous than the alternate soil types. So it definitely made sense for them to be migrating and setting up shop on these richer soils. But I think what's really interesting is these soil profiles of the volcanics will go down 20 metres, and there's really no soil horizon or distinction as you go down. And you can walk into a vineyard on these soils and not see the soil, and you'll recognise it. The plants look different. You have the same clone, planted in the same year, farmed in a very similar manner. And there's no way you could confuse the two. They're incredibly distinct. And I think for a long time, we weren't separating these sort of observations or even the fruit or the farming. And a lot of it was all being rolled in together to make what we'd call Yarra Valley Chardonnay. I'm just seeing my internet connection seems unstable again. I hope it's okay. We can jump on to the next few slides. I guess I was thinking about the things to present, because I'm going to talk a lot about history and how that affects us going forward. But given we're in the slideshow, I just thought this is a site that we finally bought a site in the Yarra last year, but we can flick through reasonably quickly. But I think where technology works, rather than just having fancy machines, I think speeding up our understanding and explaining some of the contradictions that we see within the behaviour of plants and subregions is fascinating. So we now can do things like looking at direct daylight hours in the middle of February, and across a hill, we can see there's 2 hours difference in a day in the middle of February on one hill. We can look at the next slide. But I guess running through these slides, solar irradiation is a really powerful indicator of how certain plants are behaving and how tannin ripeness can proceed. And we've got things like evapotranspiration and the impact of wind. We can go to the next slide as well. I think we've got one or two more that are the same overlays. So that's slope degrees and aspect. So I think it's interesting, and we're drawing on a lot of technology, and we're not alone in this, in terms of trying to reconcile what we're seeing either in an existing vineyard where behaviours might be not what we expect, but also then when we've got a blank canvas and we're about to plant, how are we going to be smarter about this? Because as was raised in the introduction, we don't have generations and generations of experience. And we do want to understand the nuance of our land. And I think the recognition that we do have nuance has been a really important first step. But from that, saying, yes, nuance does exist, then how do we best capture it and share it becomes the next question, which is a lovely part of the, I guess, the journey for us now to be moving into. So the next slide, I guess, we talk about technology, and Australia was such a great exponent of developing, and still is, I guess. It's just probably not a part of the industry that we delve too heavily, certainly in the winery. But we talk a lot about wine, and that's why that slide's in. The next slide, we are thankfully talking a lot more about site, and that's a lovely shot of one of the valleys in the Yarra. You can see the shadow actually on that site, which I love. And in terms of us understanding in one valley the different behaviours, even 20 years ago, this was just considered one small part of a big region. And now we're actually saying, well, look at this. This is so different. You've got east facing, west facing, the soil types are changing. And so I guess what I'm just trying to share is that a huge amount of work is being done to tease out what the fabric of not just our region, but every region, we're observing now. Well, another slide we can jump over to. It's one of our favourite little hills there, which we took a long time to find a hill on the south side of the dividing range. It's the first vineyard planted, and you can see, and then I guess the next slide is probably the most important, that for everything we do, that's another beautiful site, which is actually, this one's quite interesting. It's right at the southern end, so at the coolest end, and supposedly it should be the latest ripening block. And we found after a few years that it was the first block we would pick, and we couldn't understand why. How on earth, and I know you've got to swap the hemispheres around, so further south you're getting cooler. We have migrated through the Yarra over about a 45-kilometre distance, getting further south. We get to this vineyard in the south, in Gladysdale, and that became, over the last 5 years, the first vineyard we would pick. And we couldn't really understand why until we put that solar irradiation map over everything. And it has, as it's true north, it has some of the highest solar irradiation levels out of any part of, or any of the vineyards we work, which is, raises a whole suite of questions that we're then, trying to work through. And then the last slide, I think I'm on track, which is next. It's the people. And that was about 2 weeks ago. It was, and I love this slide, and I think this particular day for us every year is the most important. One, it brings us all together, but two, it's our really important Willie Alec vineyard, which we've had so many learnings from. And I think, what we're learning is not in isolation. We're changing the whole orientation of our thinking, and I guess critically, where I came into the industry, it was always about starting at the end point. What does the consumer want? How do you want this wine to look? And we had this belief coming through uni, you want Barolo, we'll make Barolo. You want Burgundy, we can make Burgundy. And it just completely misses the point. Obviously, you say that now, and, of course that's a dated idea. But I think some of the legacies of those schools of thought is still being felt in pockets, and it's taking time, not surprisingly, to work through it. So there's still an idea that we are trying to farm for uniformity, that every block should look the same, and we can change irrigation methods, we can change pruning methods, so that when we pick the fruit, it essentially all looks the same. That's the goal. And I think it's been a lovely revelation for me and a number of my peers that maybe that shouldn't be the goal if we're trying to understand where we're from a little bit better. Maybe what we should be doing is saying, why is that little section across the middle of the hill, why does it look so different? Why is it ripening a little bit later or a bit earlier? Why are the tannins tasting so different? Why is the acidity looking different in that parcel of fruit? So over time, we've sort of gone on this journey of not trying to unify a block, but actually let's separate those blocks. So this 1.2 hectare little block of Pinot, we pick into 5 or 6 sections every year. And it's a huge amount of work, and we get staff coming in saying, why on earth are we doing this? We should just pick long rows, pick it all together, and, you know, job's done. And we've seen people come through with us who, we had a guy who was a bit cynical and a bit older, and he'd seen it all before, and he wasn't, you know, he thought it was mad, all the trials, all the time that went into it. And when he finished up with us a little while ago, he was quite emotional, and he was just talking about how it changed his view about wine and farming. And he was more excited and more engaged about this block that he bought in Macedon, so on the other side of Melbourne, and his whole approach to try and better engage with the site. I guess it had happened over a period of time. So it is about people, and it's not that surprising, I guess. But I feel this, when we talk about people in the Yarra Valley, there's also an amazing history of the Indigenous community. And I talk about this because I think it's really quite inspiring. I think we can, that's fine with the slides, we finish with those. But, and I should have said at the beginning, we're going to go down a few rabbit holes. It's, I think there's a lot of content to get through, and I really want to share, you know, as many elements as possible. But I think the Indigenous conversation is a really vital one, because I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn, and I feel it's incredibly timely with what's going on right now in the world affairs. But I was talking to some of the elders here, you know, maybe 6 months ago. They've had a very challenging history in the Yarra Valley, but they've also had some amazing moments where they saw the first vines being planted in the late 1800s, and they saw them find their way, and they celebrated the fact that this introduced plant could be accepted by the environment here and offer something that was distinctive and unique. And I think personally, there's a few ideas I keep coming back to, and space is a really important one. Farming in the cellar to give room for personalities and nuance to come through. Time's another really important one. And the last one's become quite central is adaptation. And so this is something I've been sort of working through on my own, and I'm talking to the elders, and this particular elder, Dave Wandon, he was talking about how through 60,000 years of history, they've gone through 3 climate change events. We're talking about, you know, changing environmental conditions, but, you know, 3 significant climate change events. And the way that they have got through it is to adapt. And they said they've never had a war, and he was referencing wars in Europe that coincided with changing climate, the bigger land grabs, you know, and what that led to without wanting to change your practices. And he said the reason they've never had a war is because they just kept adapting. And he said, you know, you look at European settlement, the way they got through it was to keep adapting. And I look at even the way they look at the land today, and they're doing a lot in terms of native plants and cover crops with native species, what edible natives, things like that. And in the middle of their property, just down the road here above the Yarra River, there's this huge oak tree, enormous. It'd be, you know, over 100 years old. And they've got this visitor centre they're building. And I said, so what are you going to do with this bloody oak tree? And he said, well, this is who we are now. So of course it stays. Why would we pull it out? And all these little conversations, I think, you know, help me personally understand, you know, it's a great little life lesson that we're where we are now. And this sense of adapting and accepting and working through, you know, what's in front of us is really important. And we can apply that to all sorts of things, but I think it applies to farming so critically as well. And I look at the way irrigation gets used, and I personally, I think we all have a responsibility, particularly in Australia, to look after water. We're about 30% down on water catchment that makes it to the Yarra River now through farming, through increased residential zoning and things like that. So we know that the Yarra River is not being fed with as much water as it used to be. And I think I was probably looking at some of these older wines in the Yarra Valley from the 70s that are still drinking with such personality, and they came from young vines, young vineyards. And there is that natural assumption, particularly today here, that young vines don't really tell a great story. They tell the variety to a degree, but they're not really speaking of place. And I think it's really interesting, the farming side, in reference to giving the plant room to adapt, maybe not needing as much input from us, and then what does that offer us? And can we get back to some of those younger vineyards, you know, as we saw in the 60s and 70s, telling their story a lot more vividly from an earlier age. And I've got two kids, 9 and 11 years old, and I find the parenting, I don't know what's been more helpful, the farming for the parenting or the parenting for the farming. But I think you have different sites we walk into, you might have the same plant material, same clone, and like I was talking about with the soils, they grow differently. And do you try to make that uniform? Do you try to suffocate those differences? Which I actually did do early on. I was trying to remove the human elements. I thought if we keep everything the same, then obviously any difference is really coming down to the vine. But I think we also suffocated out some of the personality. So by taking a step back, I think has been instrumental in the plants offering something more different than what we probably ever expected. So what's the downside of this? And there's, you know, there are obviously a few, but I'd say the obvious one from a commercial point of view is that we're making wines that polarize more. They're not at times as recognizable. And I think we tasting groups, we have a lot of fantastic sort of formal programs to develop our tasting, you know, processes. But I think I look at how we go out and taste fruit, and I think about it as just another, you know, vegetable or fruit that we are putting into our body. And rather than being completely analytical, there are times you walk out and you just can't stop eating fruit. And it makes me think about those bottles that you get that just vanish. And you sort of curse yourself and think, shit, I should have spent a bit more time actually considering that wine. But something in your body, another part of the brain is like, I want to actually basically inhale that. And I think, you know, that's kind of our battle as humans as well, that we have this highly analytical side that can bring us a lot of pleasure, but we can't fully deny our instinctive animal, you know, response as well. And they don't always agree. So I think probably part of our responsibility, I feel, is to be a little bit more in tune with when we're walking out into the vineyard, you know, to allow ourselves to feel a response to the emotion of being out there. If we're eating fruit and we can't stop eating, even if the numbers look terrible, in accordance with our formal training, that we actually give some room to respond to that. And that's exciting and completely terrifying when you've got, you know, Pinots coming off at, you know, what works out to be 10.5 or 11.5%. That's not what we're striving to do. So we've got this funny reputation now of making wines that are either, you know, low alcohol or, you know, certainly low intervention, but that's not really our objective. Our objective is just to give absolute honest representation to what we're seeing in the vineyard. And I think, yeah, as I said at the beginning, I don't think it's just our team that is sort of trying to tackle that. I think we're certainly seeing that, you know, pop up in different pockets of the country. And I'd say, you know, critically, that's a big shift in mindset for, you know, a part of the industry. And I can only speak for, you know, for, I guess, a smaller part of the industry, certainly by volume. I'm going to quickly pause in case there are any questions. I'll just throw in a fair bit of content out that way.
There's nothing through on the chat. I don't know if anybody's got any questions at the moment for Mac. I've not seen anything come through.
I'm going to have a sip of beer.
Yeah, yeah, go for it. Is anybody there?
That's all right. It gave me a chance just to collect my thoughts anyway. So, yeah, I think just in terms of even talking to friends who were last out here 3 years ago, I think it's lovely them coming back and feeling a little bit of a shift. And So I think if any of you have been out here in the last, even if it's been under a decade, I suspect coming in now, there's an ongoing movement of thinking and a fairly relentless sort of digging holes and trying to work out what's what. From a farming point of view, which I keep coming back to, it's not for us just dry farming. There's a huge conversation across the continent about what density means, and I'm sure that's coming through in. It's obviously expensive doing high farming density if you're 12 or up to I think there's a farmer out in Macedon who has got 28,000 vines per hectare, which is pretty extreme. When the average in Australia is typically around that 2,700 vines per hectare. So you're looking at a huge amount of investment that's going into questioning where plant balance best sit, changing cordon height. We've had a trial running for about half a dozen years, and in the last few years, we've seen a massive difference in fruit quality just by dropping a cordon 20 centimetres from the normal, 90 centimetres down to 70. And as a result, we've changed our whole approach to new planting, that we've reduced cordon heights, much to, it's going to make pruning and picking even more challenging than what it is now in terms of staffing. But it is interesting. You run these trials and then you've got to make sense of them. And they don't always make sense. They often go against what you're thinking will eventuate. But that's the whole point of the trial. So I think the questions that are being posed are far more, critical and important to our journey than the answers. And I mean, we'll talk about it today. We've got a really amazing group of people in the business who are prepared and excited to do these trials. But, getting people in from different pockets around the world again. We've got 2 Americans that came over for harvest, and just to have those robust conversations, and the outsider coming in, you have to go back to basics and explain why you're doing something. But you definitely need the people on board who, I think there's different, obviously this industry is a million industries in one. And I think that what's exciting is we're seeing a number of peer sort of winery, grape growing businesses where the curiosity is probably the most defining thing. And instead of trying to make wines that are 100 points, we're looking at making wines that might be imperfect, but that really represent place. And this idea of perfect wines is becoming less of a goal. And I think that's a really healthy and important step. Go back to those wines that you just drink and go, oh, that maybe wasn't the most impressive wine I've, drunk this week. But what made me drink it so quickly? Was it just my mood, or was there something in the wine that I couldn't fully articulate? Makes it really interesting. And at times a bit overwhelming, but with the right people around you and you're asking the right questions, you can sort of at least walk your way through a few scenarios. And I think that idea that we inherited a bunch of trials and vineyards that we learned a lot from. The main ones being that we're completely neglected, and the neglected vineyards were almost impervious to our farming when we started farming them. They had far greater disease resistance. They weren't needing a drink when it was really dry. And so when we've converted existing vineyards to dry farming, some of the most terrifying moments of my life, where you're lying in bed thinking we've absolutely stuffed this up, and it's where you're watching the plant regulate itself differently. And this is an amazing thing for me to wrap my head around, that we've got these plants that were irrigated for 20 years, 25 years of their life, and we turn the water off, and after 3 or 4 years, they're actually growing through the season in a different way. They're regulating and holding back their canopy growth earlier in the season, and you're looking at the irrigated vineyards nearby, and they're at the top wire and they're flying along, and ours is halfway up, and you think, oh my gosh, have we got something? Are they sick? Is there something wrong? And then they just gradually push through. And when the heat wave hits, or when the drought hits, they actually are really quite calm and a lot more self-sufficient. We're doing a lot in terms of trying to measure soil activity in terms of moisture depletion and seeing where the roots really are really active. But we look at irrigated vineyards and see data on that, where the top 30 centimetres, and plants are inherently lazy, I think is a key point at this juncture, but you've got a lot of activity in that top 30 centimetres of water depletion and pickup. But if you stop the water, you don't see the root activity move down because they just haven't developed that root system there. And yet if you've got long-term dry farming, you're watching sort of almost 10 centimetre horizons of moisture depletion, gets through 10 centimetres, and then the next horizon starts to deplete. And we've only got down a bit over a metre, and you sort of get to that, and then we see growing tips occurring 2 weeks before harvest. We saw that this year after an incredibly dry summer. And our dry farm vineyards put on growing tips at the beginning of February. And the mind just boggles. They've clearly just found a bit more moisture there and think, well, you know, we can just keep chugging along. And then they hold leaf longer after you pick the grapes. So it's not like they've raced to the line and just fall over. They actually, you know, walk out now, and we picked our key Pinot blocks 2.5, 3 weeks ago. Well, they've still got, you know, a really fantastic canopy, and they're still, you know, and so that's all carbohydrates for next year. So there's this, yeah, I think there's a lovely, and you talk to the elders and they're like, oh yeah, that's what plants do, isn't it? You know, they're not annuals, and they don't understand the plant, but they understand the environment. And we had a huge storm come through here in early spring, and all these amazing old gum trees fell over in wet areas with these, I was stunned at these shallow root systems. And it just sort of was another moment to pause and consider, is this what we're doing with irrigating? And we've unfortunately got phylloxera now in the Yarra Valley as well. Came in 2007. So we are also getting the feedback of looking at the number of really old vineyards being pulled out, and the contrast in root structure between fairly conventional irrigated vineyards and some of the old dry farmed. And it's quite remarkable, the contrast in that root architecture. So I think there's a lot of, you know, our Prime Minister loves to talk about, you know, climate change future being investing in new technologies. I feel there's a huge number of solutions to our existing problems already in front of us. It's just actually trying to work out what they are. And most of them are probably staring us in the face. There's a mate who's got this incredible house in Melbourne that's all about zero waste. They had a little restaurant running it, they grew everything. He had these, I'm going off topic a little, but polystyrene, he had this worm that was digesting and turning polystyrene into organic matter. He's quite brilliant. I think he did something on Selfridge's roof, one of the wasted restaurants years ago, and did something in New York. And he's always been on this zero waste, but he talks about all these solutions for our waste problems that we already have. And I just think these ideas are, you know, are applicable across, you know, many parts of how we live. And I think the wine industry, we're really lucky that we've got a history that we can go back and look at certain things and wonder why they worked then and why aren't they quite working now, and is there something we're missing? And yeah, it's a key part of, I think, this little chapter now.
It would seem like a lot of what you're talking about is related to sustainability, but almost a natural sort of way of it coming to pass in the vineyards. A lot of people are sort of putting sustainability at the fore, but it's something that you've been doing and thinking about, probably not directly, but it's something that the soils and the plants have needed and benefit from.
I mean, I started out just by buying fruit. So all you're going in is looking at structure of pruning, you're looking at the health of the canopy, you'll be asking about soil health, but it's not really a fundamental part of assessing fruit quality. It's not any part of assessing fruit quality. And then we started leasing vineyards when we kept asking too much of the growers. And so in the end, it was after a really tough season in 2011, 5 growers said to us, you can have the bloody vineyards and do it yourself. and we had I had a viticulturalist mate on board who was helping me with the growers at the time. So it wasn't a big jump. It was sort of, it felt like it, but in hindsight, it was quite a natural progression. And so then we started looking at I guess within the boundaries of the vineyard, and you're looking at soil health in that vineyard, you're looking at plant health. But we were still limited by the idea of the trellising. We're paying for the vineyard, not for the whole block. And the owners would, you know, slash around the outside or have sheep here, or so our responsibility stopped, and therefore most of our thinking probably stopped at that point. So it was only when we took on a 30-year lease on a grazing block in a very cool, very low solar irradiation, as it turns out, part of the valley on the backside of the dividing range. And we got 30-year lease. And it was the first time we looked at this whole property and felt a real sense of responsibility. And how do we do this properly? And the first plant that we put in the ground was a fruit tree. And it became a totally different equation. And that's, you know, I'm a little frustrated that it took 15 years for us to have this opportunity to look beyond just the grapevine and that immediate environment, because I think it all feeds in to be a far more complex web than just looking at the vines and where they are in that, you know, immediate field. And what is the most powerful thing we've, you know, for me, that we've done so far is buying a block of land and looking at, you know, the wetlands that we're working, you know, we want to see in place, and how do we map it out so it's the most alive living environment, where the grapevine is just one of the beneficiaries and one of the important cogs, but just one small part. And this idea of a monoculture is just, for me, quite debilitating now. But you can apply that to anything. I think this is what my mate in Melbourne with his house has done. He said, look, anyone, you can put a pot plant on your windowsill and you're going to be better off than not. And it's just the little things we can do. It's taken for me to have more than visibility of a vineyard, but these benefits that, you know, could be far-reaching can be implemented in the smallest of ways. And I think that's really powerful.
Do you think it's the financial reason why a lot of people are not following or doing the same things as you? Bigger wineries, maybe? Higher volumes?
Yeah, look, people, I mean, I'm still the laughing stock for a lot of people. It's everything from us stopping for dinner and lunch and putting everyone around the table and opening a bottle blind and just talking, through to, we've got single state, you know, we've just planted a single state block that will end up being, you know, pruned to sort of the love heart pruning, and we might put it graft onto Gamay or something like that. But I don't know. Money is definitely a factor. You know, if I wanted to make life easier, we wouldn't be running 6 blocks in a phylloxera zone where we've got to heat treat every bit of equipment between blocks, where we've got pickers in disposable coveralls. The pickers hate coming out to us because you know, have a 35-degree day and you're saying, look, we've got these own rooted vines. We do not want to get phylloxera here. We don't know where you've been. So we can't ask you to wash your clothes here, but we can ask you to put on these coveralls. We can hot wash every bit of equipment between blocks. It ends up being not just expensive, but really, you know, tedious, the actual action of it. So you've got to have people who see the bigger vision and are excited by it, who want to do it, because it's not about money. I mean, it is to be viable, but to actually execute it, it's about people that care. And thankfully there are. I mean, it's a great industry for finding people that care.
Yeah.
It's sometimes just sharing the ideas and you see the light bulb moment, and people often searching for, I want to find where the meaning sits in this. And is that, you know, we lose people to wine because it's just another commodity, and it's another factory that processes grapes and they've turned up on a truck. And I see it in peers where, and it's not an Australian thing, this is just an industry thing where you've got, you know, and I respect the people that do it. I think they're really clever making these super technically perfect wines with rubbish fruit that they don't really know where it came from. They're quick to respond and can offer something that, you know, there's no way I can do that. I'm drowning in that situation and I appreciate it. But I think watching the spark in people's eyes, we've got an old chef who did horticulture and was pruning a few vines the last few years, and he's come to join us, and you know, he's getting down on the ground, and he's going to be amazing for us looking at different plant species, but he's actually getting really excited about the grapevine as well. And you think all these backgrounds and the twinkle in the eye, and he said to me, I'm an old bastard and I'm cynical. He said, I was brave enough to ask him if he was enjoying it. And he said, but this is really good. And I'm sweating as I ask him this, because see him as being such an amazing person for us to have in our team. So I think, yeah, it's important to hopefully to share the excitement of this industry, and just, you know, it can be really hard manual work, but the rewards are quite astonishing, I think.
And forgive me, are the wines, have you ever considered biodynamics, or is it, do you practice that, or considered it?
We put out lots of teas. We're not biodynamic, but because I look at Steiner, and Steiner was a, you know, like any science or any, you know, it all starts through observation. I do look at people putting out silica in a really hot, dry year and think, is this just sun burning the fruit? You know, you're not, is this actually the right application? So we're doing a lot with compost teas, a huge amount, and we see we need to do even more to try to understand why the horn works, the anaerobic, you know, yeah, why an anaerobic environment is so good. So a lot of the work we're doing around that, we're trying to take certain elements. We're certainly, you know, doing foliar sprays. We're looking at a lot of kelp, seaweed, fish emulsion in our compost, in addition to, you know, we've got biodynamic dairy farmers we get all their cow shit from. And, you know, so I guess we're working alongside. We've got, you know, fully organic practices, but I think we're just trying to understand what we're doing and not just take something as dogma and apply it. And maybe I'm just a slow learner, but it's important that we all, you know, everyone here, that we can do this together, and we see, you know, we can apply it. It has to be for a period of time, and then measure whether we see benefit. And we, you know, we're investing in like the solar irradiation. It's surprising when you get feedback and it makes sense, but being able to measure the soil biology is a fantastic thing for us, and we recognise we need to do more in that area. But it's a high disease pressure area. We put out, you know, with our organic program, it was still 16 sprays this year, which is a lot. And so we just try, like, I'd like to look at hybrid varieties where you've got a little bit more natural disease resistance. And you look at what's happening in Europe, it's far more progressive, I think, than here right now, because we're still, you know, if you look at the varieties introduced into Burgundy or Bordeaux or Champagne that they're looking at, if the climate keeps changing, that the identity of the region is more important than the grape. And I feel that you look at the marketers here for each region, they're like, what's the #1 grape for the region? And I feel that we actually should be working more on regional identity, not the grape tied to the region, if that makes sense. Because I think some of the solutions, and we're seeing it with the phylloxera conversation, as people are pulling out vineyards, all of a sudden, later ripening varieties, we put in some Mencia, Grenache, Nebbiolo. While our intensive examination of subregions as Pinot and Chardonnay, we're also thinking about what's in 20 or 40 years, what gift are we leaving for the next generation? And so if we're putting in some of these varieties now that might make absolutely green rubbish wines, let's still give them a chance, because we don't know what's around the corner.
There's a couple of, thank you. There's a couple of questions that have come through. And one is from Ines. Okay. She's asking, can Mac elaborate a bit more on climate change and potential challenges to reach balanced alcoholic and phenolic ripeness?
Well, a few parts to that one. Well, no doubt there's, you know, a changing climate. You just have to look at the floods that have happened in Hunter Valley, you know, New South Wales and Queensland. Remarkably, we have probably got through the last few years a lot better in terms of winter and spring rainfall, regular rain events, but nothing catastrophic as a region here. We haven't had bushfires since '09, and that is a serious, you know, touch wood, because every summer we're waiting for it, I guess. Thankfully, go back to the Indigenous, the way they used to do their much cooler burning technique, so that they would clear undergrowth very gently. And so now a lot of the Vic Forestry are engaging the elders to come in and actually work with them to do really sensible burning at the right time, which then ultimately leads to lower fire risk in those areas. So there's a whole, once again, returning to some of the old practices that were employed for tens of thousands of years makes a huge amount of sense. In terms of I guess physiological or phenolic ripeness, it's still a year-by-year assessment, and some of that you're assessing through trials around density, through rootstock, clone, row orientation. New vineyards now might be going east-west when they previously have been planted north-south. Cordon height, it's often the trade-off, I think, of if you drop the cordon or you've got higher density, you're getting increased humidity and you get much fresher, naturally harmonious fruit, I believe, but then you're also combating, greater mildew pressure. So I think it's still, look, there's people who are stripping leaves every year, and then there's people like us that really aren't removing any leaf at all. And that's healthy. I would hate to look around the region and see everybody applying the same practice. I think that's where you stop growing. So it's definitely a question. We saw this year completely different behaviour. People think we've got low alcohol wines, and our vineyard team this year freaked out because we were picking our first few picks were coming in to the equivalent of 12.5% alcohol. And they're like, but this is too ripe. And I'm like, it's not. The fruit was green. We all agreed to it. You're just looking at a number now. It happens to be higher than the last few years, but acid and phenolic ripeness were absolutely not at the point we'd want to pick at 11.5. So we were picking purely on phenolic ripeness in the end, and that was at higher sugars. So how that pendulum swings, we don't chaptalize, we don't, I think we acidified one Pinot block that was really stressed coming from a phylloxera vineyard this year. And that would go into our basic wine. But I think it's interesting if you, and our approach is we can get mouthfeel and extract it if the sugars are low. We're looking at how we can naturally get a bit more mouthfeel. But the conversation definitely as a region comes back to where are we seeing phenolic ripeness in relation to other components of the grape, including acidity, green acidity, harder malic acidity, through to what looks like a riper, more balanced acidity.
Thank you, Mac. There's one question just come in from Hannah. She's asking about in relation to sustainability. What's your view on bottles versus other types of packaging?
A good one. We've got a few examples here, actually. It's difficult. Well, we've signed up to an Australian-wide sustainability program, something that we want primarily internally for us to just, for anyone walking into the business knows this is our expectation. And it's a really well mapped out program designed more for big companies. So there's some little hurdles for us, but we've just reduced and changed, well, we changed all our glass in the last 12 months, but it's taken 3 years to find the right glass supplier, and it's in Germany. Great with all the freight and logistical headaches right now. We're really small. So I guess the thing we're constantly battling with is, do we have any influence? And it's actually a friend who is head of procurement for the Asahi Group and has a budget of sort of $1.5 billion. He's the one that says, you've got a voice, just go and annoy them and see how many other little producers in the Yarra, whether the association representing the growers can get on board. But he said, trust me, if you're asking it and everyone, a few other people are thinking it and they all put it into writing, that is going to make an impact. And I think, all these little light bulb moments. So yeah, since my mate told me that, I have been a little bit more annoying, and we are trying to push for some of the local glass manufacturers to collect glass from, as a regional hub and take it in, and if we could get a proprietary bottle or whatever it is, I don't really care, but it's, I think Australia right now lags a little bit behind on the green credentials, but we also have less choice, there's less competition. So once again, going back to, it costs a bit more, but we are, we're sticking pretty true to, everything from cardboard to our waste and the power of social media. We were bottling just before Christmas, and our waste company had been refusing to talk to us about picking up plastic. So I just took a photo of our poor old, general waste with all the plastic, and just made a couple of comments and copied them in. And I got a call the other day from, one of their more senior staff members saying, we'd like to help. So I think you've got to pull all the tricks out you can and make the right waves that you can. And we tried to follow through normal channels and got nowhere. So yeah, I think there's a bit of a battle, especially when you feel small and pretty insignificant, in your size and value to some of these businesses. But I guess that's the job to be done.
Thank you, Mac.
Okay, before we draw this session to a close, one question which I'm sure you can't answer too quickly, but looking at grape varieties and all this, are we going to see changes from the classic grape varieties that you're growing at the moment? I know you are doing lots of experimentation. Are there any that are coming out as particularly exciting or valuable?
It's a great question, actually. And it was a friend who was talking a little while ago, who said, imagine if on the first fleet and when James Busby first came out, imagine if he'd brought Italian varieties instead of French. And you actually think about Riverland and all these regions who are now, planting this wide array of different cultivars that probably are more suited to really sunny, fairly dry, environments. I suspect that the conversation around the Australian identity would look somewhat different. But yeah, so I guess it will probably for a while look a little more complicated in some ways, Touriga Nacional and all, some of these Portuguese varieties that we're seeing popping up. I think certainly Grenache in that sort of whole bunch, quite, red fruited spectrum has made, and McLaren Vale is a great example. I remember years ago thinking Shiraz in McLaren Vale was sort of the identity, and it was looking pretty heavy. And where does a region like that go when people started to look for fresher wines? And then all these amazing old Grenache bush vines all of a sudden started getting recognised. So I think there's a really healthy re-examination of what's what. I think I look at the Yarra Nebbiolo, and there's not many places outside of northern Italy where Nebbiolo's got a nice foothold, and there's certainly some lovely gravelly soils in the Yarra that are offering some really bright, recognisably Nebbiolo style, but also that medium-bodied weight of the Yarra Valley. So I'm hopeful for Nebbiolo. I think Gamay will have a huge, talk to the nurseries here, there will be a huge flood of Gamay. It's a little tsunami coming through, I think, which is great, because I look at some of the really overt ripe styles of Gamay coming out of Beaujolais, and if we can just, I think probably will happen here as well to a degree, but there's some really lovely, vivid, bright, expressions of Gamay, which seem to suit slightly warmer conditions where Pinot might be starting to suffer. We're, roughly 20 days earlier than we were 20 or 30 years ago. So there is an acknowledgement that old Pinot sites may no longer, might move to something that's a bit more suited to the early ripening. So I think that's a really fun part of it all. And there is, the Australian flexibility of being able to put anything where you want, is great. It can complicate, but I think a lot of our customers, at least, are really excited to just come on the journey and see where it all ends up. I think I was going to mention that before, with the idea of these 100-point wines and reaching a pinnacle. I'd say most of the wines that I buy from people in Australia, it's less about they've reached the pinnacle, it's more, where is this journey for them going? And you're not expecting every wine to be remarkable, but it's the body of work and where it's going that makes it so powerful and engaging.
Brilliant. That's absolutely great, Mac. Thank you so much. I think not only have we learned a lot, you've made us think, which is a great thing with these webinars. So a huge thank you, especially for doing it when you're in the middle of harvest and you've got to go back to work now at 9 o'clock in the evening.
I'm grateful.
Thank you very much indeed.